Okay, here we go. All right, we talked about the 3 bribes. Now, here's the thing. The bribe of $250,000. Just had to give us money, $250,000 to stay out of war. Well, when these 3 insulting demands reached back to the citizens of the United States, what do you think they demanded?
What's the third one?
The United States must pay a bribe of $250,000. Did that one got cut off?
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's just kind of reiterate. The United States had to publicly apologize for negative comments made by President Adams against the French during a speech he gave to Congress. The United States would be forced to grant a loan to France, and the third ultimatum was the United States had to pay a bribe of $250,000 to France so they wouldn't go to war with us. Well, when these 3 insulting demands reached back to the citizens of the United States, Americans demanded war. That's what they wanted.
War?
They demanded war. So, the United States began to make war preparations, and I'm going to give you 3 examples of what they did. So with war in the balance, the United States began war preparations, and they did these 3 things. First of all, the government created the Department of the Navy that would go under the Department of War. Okay? So they created the Department of the Navy. Because most of this battle with France is probably going to be fought from a naval perspective. Okay? So they created the Department of the Navy to go under the Department of War's oversee. Second thing they did, the United States, is they built warships and fortified our harbors. Okay? We built warships and fortified our harbors. What does that mean if we fortified our harbors? Reinforce them against attack, yeah. So we built warships and fortified our harbors. And the third thing we did, which is obvious, is we strengthened what we had at the time that was a weak what? Army. So, with war in the balance, the United States began war preparations. They created the Department of the Navy. They built warships and fortified our harbors, and they strengthened our army. Now, as I mentioned, many Americans were demanding war with France at this time, including several members of the Federalist Party, which was the president's own party. And despite the pressures to go to war, because he knew what was going to happen, President Adams performed probably the most courageous act of his presidency. He made one more ditch effort to avoid war, and in 1799, he sent another group of American diplomats back to France to try to give it one last ditch effort to avoid. So as we created the Department of the Navy, as we built warships and fortified our harbors, as we strengthened our army, despite the pressures Adams had from even members of his own party to go to war, he tries one last time to avoid, and in 1799, he sends another group of American diplomats to France. Now, we catch a break, because just before he sends over this next group, guess what happens to the government of France? It gets overthrown. Okay, so luckily for the United States, just prior to this new group of American diplomats arriving in France, the country was overthrown. They had another revolution. And the man that led that revolution, you've heard of, I'm sure, Napoleon. Okay? So a revolutionist by the name of Napoleon had overthrown the French government and made himself dictator. That happened just prior to these American diplomats going over, which was a very lucky break for the United States. Now, this has just worked perfect for us. Napoleon didn't want to start his rule of France with a bunch of conflicts with other countries, right? Why would you? Okay? So he wants to begin his reign of France free from conflict with other countries. So he was very eager to reach a settlement with the United States. He didn't want to go to war with the United States. He wanted to get this new government going and be free of conflict. So, what we did in essence is Napoleon got together with these American diplomats and both sides agreed to abandon what treaty? Treaty of 1778. So finally it's gone. France cannot hold it over our heads any longer. So Napoleon and the United States agreed to abandon the Treaty of 1778. So we do not have an alliance with that country that they can continue to hold over our heads and threaten us with. Well, by working out this with Napoleon, President Adams avoids a full-scale war with France. But who did he sacrifice popularity with? His own party. Very good, because his party was calling for war. So one of the most courageous acts of his presidency, he avoids a full-scale war with France, which we cannot afford. However, he's going to sacrifice tremendous popularity with his own party. Okay? Last thing we're going to talk about today is the election of 1800. Election of 1800. Now, kind of like we do today, during that election year of 1800, members of both the Federalist and Republican parties met in one place to nominate their candidates. And these meetings became known as caucuses, okay, which we still use today. Now we have a national convention in which we do all this stuff that's pretty fancy-dancy, but for the first time in American history, Republican and Federalist parties are going to get together and they're going to meet together in what's called caucuses, meetings, to select who their candidates are going to be for the upcoming election. So during the election year of 1800, members of both the Federalist and Republican parties met to nominate candidates for the presidency and the vice presidency, and these meetings became known as caucuses. Okay? Now, as far as the Federalist caucus went, they chose President Adams for a second term for president, and they nominated Charles C. Pinckney as vice president. Okay, not Thomas Pinckney, but Charles C. Pinckney as vice president. Anybody do a report on him? Is he related to Thomas Pinckney?
That I don't.
And you think he is? We'll check that out. You might be surprised. The Republicans again choose Thomas Jefferson for president and Aaron Burr for the vice presidency. So they do not change their candidates from 1796 to 1800. They go with Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. Now, remember what the rule is, right? Whoever gets the most votes as president, whoever gets the second most votes as vice president. But we've kind of got this unwritten law now that at least people that are Federalists will vote for both the Federalist candidates and both people that are Republicans will vote for both Republican candidates. Well, this election was a little interesting too, because when they tabbed up all the electoral votes, Jefferson and Burr had exactly the same number. But they're from the same party, at least, right? But they have the same number. Now, this is where you're going to see, because of a constitutional amendment that's been used, that we'll talk about in the future, what happens if a person does not win an election clearly. Now, today, you have to have 2/3 majority of the electoral votes to win. You have to have a certain number of electoral votes. What would happen in this election if Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, all the results came in, and none of them had the required electoral votes to win? What would they do? Anybody know that? You might think they'd re-vote, right? Can you imagine that? Seriously. So the constitutional amendment states that in a case like this, and it's going to happen in this one, is that it goes to the House of Representatives, and they vote on who the president's going to be. So if Hillary Clinton and Trump would end up not getting enough electoral votes in this election to win, then the House of Representatives, all the members of the House, would get together and vote, and whoever they voted for, majority vote, would be the president. Well, that's what happened here. It was the first time in history. The Constitution called that if there was a tie It would be broken in the House of Representatives. You didn't have to have a certain amount of electoral votes now to be president. You just had to have the most, right? Well, they had a tie. So this is going to go to the House of Representatives. So how many representatives do we have in the House at this time? 59. So those 59 members of the House are going to vote to elect which of these men will be president and which one will be vice president. Now, you have to think about this. What were most of the congressmen that were in the House, what party were they? Because that's going to matter, isn't it? So if you have a Federalist House, you'd think the Federalist candidate would get voted for, and if you had a Republican House, the Republican candidate probably would get because of the majority. Well, this was a Federalist-controlled House. But what was the problem, Dalton? They were both Republicans. So it's kind of a weird deal. So at the time, the House of Representatives was dominated by Federalists. And they never saw either candidate as the answer, did they? Think about it, okay? Well, most of the Federalists in the House favored Aaron Burr, okay? Most of them favored Aaron Burr. Well, do you think they just shut themselves up and vote and that's it? You got people trying to talk them into everything in the world, right? Well, here was a key Federalist. Who was the head of the Federalist Party? Who was the leader of it? Alexander Hamilton. Well, what Alexander Hamilton did is he used his influence and he convinced the Federalists in the House to go with Jefferson because he didn't like Burr much. So most Federalists in the House favored Aaron Burr, and if Alexander Hamilton would not have gotten involved, probably history would be different because Aaron Burr would have probably been the president. But Alexander Hamilton used his strong influence within his party, and he convinced those Federalist members of the House who were going to control how this goes to take Thomas Jefferson. And Hamilton really viewed Jefferson as no good. He just thought he was the, you ever heard this expression? Lesser of two evils.
That's what they use for this debate, I guess.
Okay? So Hamilton viewed Jefferson as the lesser of two evils, and as a result, Jefferson was elected president and Aaron Burr would become vice president by virtue of the vote of the House of Representatives. Well, because of the confusion we've had over these first two elections, Congress passed the 12th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And it was because of the confusion. We've had unusual circumstances in both, have we not? Okay? Well, the 12th Amendment of the Constitution states that voters must do what? Vote on separate ballots for president and vice president. So you're not going to have this problem again, okay, of two guys tying, so to speak. So the 12th Amendment of the Constitution was passed shortly after this election because of the confusion of this election and how the first one turned out, 1796. And as a result, the 12th Amendment states that voters have to vote on separate ballots for the office of president and vice president. Now, did that mean that you couldn't have, according to these rules, two people of the different party? If they still could, you still could do that. They're just voting for president on this one and vice president on this one. But it was still a kind of a common rule that if you voted Federalist for president, you'd vote Federalist for vice president too. But we were all on the same ballot. You just picked. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, in addition to controlling the presidency and the vice presidency, guess who gained control of the Congress in this election? The Republicans. So this is a good thing for Jefferson. So you're going to have a Republican president, a Republican vice president, and then you're going to have a Republican-controlled Congress. Okay? Now, what our plan is, just so you know, is Monday we're going to finish this lecture, which is the last subtopic, Final Actions by President Adams, which is very short. Then I'm going to give you a review, and then we're going to have a test on Tuesday. Okay, that's the deal. Any questions on that? And then we won't have any worries for those of you that might be going to state volleyball and all of that business. Okay? All right, good job today. Double lecture, back to back.